Hi, I'm Mr. Vitito. This is lecture number 5 for the Imperialism Unit in the United States History and Government course for the New York State curriculum. Today our topic is going to be War on the Home Front, and this topic is particularly useful for students who in this unit will be working on the B level, applying a lot of what they've learned, vocabulary and otherwise, that kind of learning you've received on the C level, now you're going to use it on the B level. And in this unit, the B level is based on a lot of the material you would learn in this unit. These are the notes that we'll be using for today's lecture, and your job is to take these notes down. And if you're not in my class and you're absent at home and you're viewing this, then you're going to bring me these notes and be able to talk to me about what they mean. So follow me over. I'm going to put this under the document camera, and we're going to talk through a little bit of what's going on with this, all right? First of all, you're going to notice the color that is on this concept map. I like color a lot, and one of the things that I want to tell you is that you're going to notice that War on the Home Front leads off in 1 color, 2 colors, 3 colors. But the third color is kind of divided up into 3 different parts. So some version of that red or red-ish thing, okay? So looking up here at my screen, you're going to see that there is the entire document, and I'm going to scan in on one part right in the middle first of all. Focus on it. This is War on the Home Front, and in fact I'm going to go down the green side of this thing. War on the Home Front. One of the first things I want you to know is that during any war, presidential power always increases. I don't care if you're talking about George Bush right now during the War on Terror, or if we're talking about Franklin Delano Roosevelt during World War II, or Woodrow Wilson during this war, World War I. Even Teddy Roosevelt gained power, okay, during times of conflict. So this is something that we need to be kind of aware of as a theme in American history. You may find yourself on a Part 2 thematic essay in the New York State Regents writing about something like this. It's a very important theme. So let me at least fill you in on how his power went up during World War I. In World War I, what he did was he refocused the private economy. And keep in mind that the private economy is businesses that are privately owned. The government in a capitalist society does not tell a private business how they are to behave. They're working for the profit motive. They do whatever they want to do so long as it is within the bounds of the law. So what role would the president have to play here? What President Woodrow Wilson was good at doing was bringing together business and government for a common purpose. And that common purpose was winning a war. Now, there's a lot of money to be made off the war, so it wasn't as if this wasn't in the private business's best interest to work together with government. It really worked well. So one of the ways in which he's going to refocus the private economy is he's going to create a war industry board. Now, the war industry board is going to work with private companies. These private companies, for example, might be making automobiles, but how difficult would it be if they were to manufacture tanks? If they made automobile engines to create aircraft engines, how difficult would that transition be? Probably not that difficult. Additionally, manufacturers for, say, lipstick. They create a little cartridge that the lipstick goes inside of. How's that so different from a bullet that goes inside of a casing? Many times it's just a simple retooling of the equipment that already exists. And the War Industry Board helped to change the private manufacturers who made one sort of product in peacetime to change over and to create a different kind of product during wartime. So that's your War Industry Board. An additional note that I have coming from the War Industry Board is that mass production went up 20%. The output of these factories went up 20%. Part of what the War Industries Board did was they encouraged the Henry Ford style of manufacturing with an assembly line, because assembly line production is very efficient, both in terms of time but also in terms of cost. So you're able to make things much more quickly, much less expensively. And if you think about war and the cost of bullets, we're going to go through a lot of them, so it'd be better for them to be cheaper, as you can imagine. All right, so we have mass production on the assembly line, but the assembly line also offers us one other thing, and that is going all the way back 100 years prior, just about, Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts. Well, heck, if a trigger breaks on a gun, how difficult would it be to replace the trigger if it's an interchangeable part made on an assembly line? Every trigger looks like every other trigger. Just pull out the broken part and fix the gun. So that's the kind of thing that I think that was the value of the War Industry Board. Now, the President of the United States also increased power as he refocused the private economy by how he dealt with our need for food during war. Soldiers clearly needed food for war, so if he could get the American public to conserve their own food consumption, that food then the food saved or not used could go off to soldiers. So we're going to find that the Food Administration is going to encourage meatless days and sweetless days and wheatless days and porkless days, and so it goes on. And any other way in which people could try to conserve food consumption. One thing that people were encouraged to do, particularly women, because they weren't going to work, was to grow what was known as victory gardens. Whoops, how about I take my shadow away? All right, something called a victory garden, which was nothing more than growing your tomatoes and your cucumbers and things like that in your own backyard so you didn't have to make purchases. Anything that was surplus food would have been canned and sent over to the war front for our soldiers. Never did we want our war soldiers to actually suffer. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to move our notes into a yellow section. So you're going to see this little switch and slide here, okay? And what you're going to see is that we need to actually sell our war. Selling the war at home, well, I'm going to tell you that took a lot of doing. We have three different ways that war needed to be sold. First of all, we needed to raise money, which is what we actually sold Liberty bonds for. Liberty bonds is where someone would take a piece of their paycheck, they would spend it on a Liberty bond. Essentially, they're giving Uncle Sam, say, $20 with the promise that that $20 would be paid back in interest at a later date. So selling war bonds and buying war bonds was a very patriotic thing. Obviously, selling the war to the public was also something that was important to do, and so the Committee on Public Information was in charge of doing this, and a lot of times this Committee on Public Information used propaganda. Propaganda is the kind of posters that you see during war that glorify war, that pull at the heartstrings and make you want to be patriotic, or maybe even make you hate the enemy, in which, in this case, the Germans were dressed as if they were Huns. They were savage and brutal and sadistic, and that made it, good, upstanding Americans want to go to war and, get rid of all of these mean, evil people. So the Committee on Public Information did this. We'll even find, maybe to a lesser degree during World War I, but certainly during the Spanish-American War, yellow journalism is something that can also sensationalize events so that it makes the American public want to go to war. And that was definitely a word we associate with the Spanish-American War and newspapers. And newspapers essentially would want to sell their newspapers, so if you could provide them with an interesting picture, they'd make up the story to go with it. Right? So that's actually a famous saying from the Hearst newspaper company, that if you provide the picture, we'll provide the story. And it wasn't necessarily a true story. That's yellow journalism. Also at this time, there was a huge anti-immigrant hysteria in America, and that's because so many of our recent immigrants came from Germany. My own family, the Vittetos, came from Germany. Actually, it wouldn't have been the Vittetos. It would have been the Fortman family. They spelled their name F-O-R-T-M-A-N-N. And that double N ending on a name is very Germanic. And I know that in my own family history, the Fortmans dropped the second N because they were afraid to be identified as German during this time. So we became very nativist at this point in time, and we weren't necessarily in love with Germans. Although here in the Capital District of New York State, there was a high concentration of Germans, German-American clubs, and so people actually were opposing this war if they could, and so German-American clubs did. I mean, who wants to join the army and go over and shoot your cousin, right, in World War I? So that's kind of our local thing. But there were others who were also opposed to war, and so to kind of stop this opposition, the Espionage and Sedition Acts were passed. And basically this made it illegal to speak out against the war or to do things that would hurt the war effort. Now, a gentleman by the name of Schenck is a guy who handed out literature to try to get people to not report for duty if they were being drafted in the war. He handed out pamphlets to people who stood in line for the draft saying, you don't have to come, or you don't have to go to war, you don't have to do this, you have other choices. The Supreme Court said that he was making a clear and present danger for the United States. If he succeeded in doing what he was doing on a large scale, we'd committed to a war. We could lose a war this way. So, the Schenck versus the United States, it is a landmark Supreme Court case that I want you to know, and really its importance is that it draws a clear line as to where your freedoms might end. If you've ever heard that saying, hey, I've got the freedom to make a fist and throw a punch, but your freedom to do so ends where your fist and my nose meet, because that becomes assault. You don't have the freedom to actually punch people. You don't have the freedom to just say anything you want, particularly if you create a clear and present danger. Another example of a clear and present danger would be yelling fire in a crowded theater. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes used that as an example to justify this opinion of his, saying that Americans have freedom of speech, but there are limits to everything. Now, moving on. We're now moving to the kind of pink side of things, or the red side of things, and this represents social change, and what we're going to do is move in 3 different directions, okay? The first direction that we're going to move in is upward, toward women, okay? So a social change that occurred during World War I at home on the war front is that women's role changed. They were taking jobs in factories. And I know earlier I said something to the effect like they weren't working in factories. I don't know what I was thinking when I said that. They were working in factories and taking the men's job. They were taking off the dresses and putting on the pants, so to speak. So if you've ever heard that, who wears the pants in the family, all right, that's like a post-World War I saying, because a lot of women continue to have an appetite for going out and working jobs and earning money and having more of a say in their family. When it comes to having more of a say, some women actually were a part of the women's peace movement because they were pacifists. And what's interesting is at this time they didn't even have the vote. So there are many issues that women had on their plate, and here's one. They didn't want to send their babies off to war. That's not every woman. That was some women felt this way. So some women were pacifists, just like some men were pacifists. All right. Looking across at some of the other contributions that women made, okay, besides the factory jobs and working for the Red Cross, in their backyards, again, we mentioned this earlier, they were growing victory gardens, they were selling war bonds because that was so patriotic a thing to do. And in the end, what I want you to know, something that we learned in our progressive unit, in our last unit, is that women were given the right to vote, the 19th Amendment. It's because their contribution in this war was finally being acknowledged. So I have that as our final note. Coming off of women, we come up this way and we have 19th Amendment, women's role acknowledged. I shouldn't have to tell you that that's the women's right to vote, but it most certainly was. Now, speaking of a woman and their typical social roles at home, here's something that was occurring at this time, and that is the 1918 flu pandemic. 500,000 Americans died during this. 30 million died worldwide. And I have to tell you that Germans actually died at a much greater rate than Americans did. I can't explain why. This pandemic lasted from 1918 to 1919, but 1 in 4 people in America fell victim to this. The odds would have been even greater in Germany. Still, I don't think anybody really knows why that is, or not that I know of anyway. All right, so that flu pandemic had a huge impact, even on the American psyche. We're not only losing people at war, but we're losing people at home. So it feels like that war has definitely impacted us here. Finally, the last group I want to talk about for social change is the African American. If you recall, during Reconstruction, African Americans were left in the South sharecropping, and their existence was pretty poor, particularly given segregation and things of that nature. But knowing that we don't have immigrants coming to this country from Germany anymore, or from Central Asia, we had this great need for filling factory jobs and inviting African Americans to move north. Oftentimes they had to run in the dead of night because there were laws in the South to stop them from moving away from places where they had debt. The blacks migrated up to the north, all right, for the purpose of taking factory jobs. Now, where did they move to? They moved to the big cities, of course. This is where the factories were. And Chicago and Harlem, that's what that says, is Harlem. Chicago and Harlem would have been two of those places that they would have moved to, okay, and where they'd experienced a lot of success. And if you think about it, in the South they were constantly in debt. In the North they could make $5 a day, and they ran away from their debt, so they're actually able to make something for themselves. What I want to allude to right now is in our next unit, when we study the 1920s, we'll actually be talking about the Harlem Renaissance, which is African Americans having a great opportunity now to have some prosperity and to do something with it. And it's a great moment in American history to celebrate African Americans and to look at their literature, their artwork, their music, and to look at the impact that they actually had on white society. It's pretty fantastic, actually, for them. So that's going to be for our next unit. Right now, this concludes lecture number 5, War on the Home Front, in our Imperialism unit. Good luck, guys, working on the B and the A levels. I hope you do well in the unit. Bye-bye.